So I'm about to give the 1AC, which is where I set forth the affirmative plan and some of the reasons why it's a good idea. Is everyone ready? My partner and I offer for your consideration the following plan. The United States federal government should substantially increase its transportation infrastructure investment in the United States by increasing transportation equity in planning and development, including increases in active transportation infrastructure and in public transit. Our first observation is inherency. Current transportation funds are directed away from the areas that have the greatest need. Low transportation funding excludes people of color from access to centers of power and negatively impacts their public health. This is according to the Leadership Conference on the Education Fund in 2011. People from urban areas and people of color are significantly underrepresented in the institutions that decide how to invest transportation funds, which results in a strong preference for transportation benefiting outlying areas. People without access to cars have been isolated from services, including healthcare. Policies contribute to poor air quality, pedestrian fatalities, obesity, and asthma in urban areas. All of these have disproportionately affected low-income people and people of color. Our second observation is the harms. The advantage is social injustice. Transportation access is the key to full participation in all elements of society, including education, health services, job markets, family, and recreation. Our focus on the car excludes some groups from full participation in society. This is according to Carol Martins at the Institute for Management Research at Radford University. Transport shapes people's life opportunities. It determines whether a person can take advantage of education and health services, job markets, contact with family friends, and recreational facilities. Focus on mobility has brought freedom and independence for a large part of the population, but this is at the expense of the freedom of a carless minority. Further, transportation problems are worse for low-income areas and communities of color. Those without cars are less likely to have access to public transit. This is according to Karen Lucas, who's a professor at the University of Oxford, in 2012. Black Americans are far less likely to own and drive a car. American Indians, Hispanics, Pacific Islanders, Asians, and people of mixed race are all also less likely to own cars than white Americans. Low-income households also have less access to public transit. The result of all of this is transportation apartheid. This is according to Robert Bullard, who's a Wade Professor of Sociology at Clark Atlanta University. Transportation decisions shape economic opportunities. Transportation policies have aided racial, economic, and environmental inequalities as evidenced by segregated housing. Millions of Americans have been socially isolated, and a transportation apartheid has been created. Our third observation is solvency. Now is a critical time for increasing social equity in transportation. You should follow Rosa Parks' example in the 21st century. This is Todd Lippman at the Victoria Policy Institute and Mark Brenman at the Social Justice Constituency and a senior advisor to the City Project in 2011. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to obey a bus driver's order to give her seat to a white passenger. Most Montgomery, Alabama African-American residents who can drive and who can afford an automobile are probably better off now. However, residents of all races who either cannot drive or who would prefer to use alternative modes of transportation are probably worse off because their communities are less walkable, bus service declined, and development patterns are more sprawled. Transport system discrimination has changed. It results less from race or ethnicity and more from disability and poverty. It is therefore important to develop comprehensive and practical methods for achieving social equity. Finally, we must mandate equitable distribution of active transportation resources, according to Robert Garcia of the City Project in 2009. Opportunities to engage in physical activity and access to and use of public transportation are environmental strategies that have found to have been related to increased physical activity levels. I stand ready for cross-examination.
Okay, can you restate your plan? Are you going to, provide more funding for public transportation?
Yeah, we provide more funding for public transportation and also for things like sidewalks and bicycle paths.
Oh, okay. How much do you think it will cost to provide more money for public transportation?
We can't be sure exactly how much, and we don't specify an exact amount, but you can probably assume maybe like a couple $100 million.
Okay. Also, can you talk more about, so you're saying that if a person don't have access to transportation and it's like, injustice? Is that
Yeah.
what you're saying? Okay, how do you account for I guess how do you determine whether or not a person has a lot of access to transportation? Say hypothetically, if they live in New York, would low-income people that live in New York be considered, like, I guess, not being able to get around?
Well, I don't think we can account for any particular person, or even, we have limited knowledge, any particular community. But I think what our evidence speaks to is that, on balance, if you live in a low-income community or a community of color, you're less likely to have transportation that will take you to places like, say, the hospital, or a job you might want, or a recreational facility where you might want to, relax and have a good time. And when you look on average, it ends up being worse for a lot of these low-income communities.
Okay, let's talk more about the solvency. How is us funding public transportation, how is that equivalent to Rosa Parks?
I think when you look at the problem that existed 60 years ago, it was this very explicit problem, where if you had a certain skin color, you would not be allowed to sit at the front of the bus. Now we want to say the problem is more of an implicit problem. It's that there's no rule that says that low-income people or people of color don't have access to transportation, but there is this sort of implicit discrimination where the resources aren't as good. So we think that if you want to be a 21st century Rosa Parks, rather than refusing to sit in a certain place on the bus, you need to be active and actually increase funding in some of these communities.
Okay, thank you.
All right. I'm going to give the 1NC, in which I'm going to outline a major reason why we think that the plan is a bad idea, and also answer their arguments for why they think that the plan is a good idea. And so first I'm going to read an off-case argument, and then I'm going to answer the case. Is everyone ready? Our off-case argument is the budget disadvantage. A, uniqueness. The U.S. is displaying fiscal discipline now. Spending is growing at a snail's pace. This is Peter Baker, a blogger for the New York Times in 2012. Spending under Obama had grown even more slowly than under Hoover. The president has significant fiscal restraint and balanced spending. Any report to the contrary would be sloth and laziness. Bush's tax cuts contributed to the red ink. Spending will fall in the next fiscal year as currently projected by the CBO. B, the link. Spending on public transit funding alone requires substantial spending increases. This is Lawrence Gostin of Georgetown and Jennifer Pomeranz of Yale in 2009. Federal legislation for all modes of transportation is an opportunity to provide new funding mechanisms and significant increases in federal funding for public transportation. The current bill included $53 billion for public transportation. Advocates say that the figure will need to be increased substantially to supply public transportation. C, internal link. Continued deficit spending will collapse the economy. This is Congressman Phil Rowe in 2011. Spending is a matter of national security. Cuts need to be made to avoid severe economic disruptions. The IMF report adds urgency. Moody's released a report forecasting a downgrade. If we fail to stop the spending, our nation will face economic collapse in the long term. D, impact. Economic collapse risks a global nuclear war. This is Harris, who has a PhD in European history at Cambridge, and Burroughs, a counselor in the National Intelligence Council in 2009. History may be instructive. The Great Depression lessons include the harmful effects on fledgling democracies and multi-ethnic societies. The potential for conflict could grow in a volatile economic environment. Terrorist groups become self-radicalized. The most dangerous casualty would be the Middle East. Worries lead states to consider nuclear ambitions. Conflict could lead to an unintended escalation and broader conflict. Short warning and missile flight times and uncertainty places more focus on preemption, which leads to escalating crises. Now I'll answer the case arguments. 1. Transportation policy alone is not enough to solve for social injustice. You need social inclusion policies in all areas, not just transportation. This is Karen Lucas, a professor at Oxford, and their author in 2012. Transport and social exclusion can never survive as a solely transport-focused agenda. Accessibility planning must be highly integrated with socially responsible land use, housing, health, education, and welfare policies and programs. 2. Their social inequity studies about roads are old and outdated. This is Chai of the Department of Sociology at Mississippi State University and Parisi of the Social Science Research Center of Mississippi State University in 2011. Highway effects on racial redistribution have been documented in a limited number of historical case studies. These studies only describe the effects qualitatively and only focus on the early and mid-20th century, before the legal bases for social and environmental justice and highway construction were established. Little is known about the effects that highways have after these bases. 3. Equality in transportation justice is impossible. This is Martins et al., again one of their authors from the Institute for Management Research at Radboud University in 2012. Theoretical modeling studies have shown that even if starting from an even distribution of opportunities over space, centers will rapidly develop over time. Space by its very nature is divided into center and periphery, and not every point on a plane can be equidistant from the important centers of opportunities. Inequality in access to life opportunities is inevitable. Transport policies cannot correct the differences. They would at best redefine or reinforce the relationship. And now stand ready for cross-examination.
So you make an argument that we're spending a lot of money, or that we're not spending too much money now, but the plan is a big increase in that.
Sure.
From where I'm standing, it seems like we're spending billions on the military, we're spending trillions bailing out big corporations. Why, in that context, can't we spend, a couple $100 million or a couple $1 billion to help people in poverty who are really in a lot of need?
Sure, but first of all, Obama has drastically decreased the amount of spending that we've done on the military compared to the Bush administration, which means that he's been showing significant fiscal restraint. Our evidence also indicates that the rate of growth of spending has been smaller than any other president, even Hoover, even though he has been spending money in certain areas, he's in general been unwilling to spend it on random projects that are not connected to his overall agenda. So for example, yeah, he was able to pass the stimulus where he had to bail out the corporations. That was central to the Democratic platform at that time. The plan would not be seen in quite that way, and it would be spun as being fiscally irresponsible.
Okay, so you say that if there is an economic decline, that will cause wars, that will cause, say, terrorists to be radicalized in the Middle East.
Sure.
Obviously, we're sort of in the midst of an economic decline now. There was a really, it was really terrible 2 or 3 years ago. What's changed in those 2 or 3 years that now it's going to be really catastrophic?
Definitely. First of all, I would say Harrison Burroughs was written in the last couple of years, and they say it could get a lot worse if things get worse. Also, our internal link evidence about the decline is from 2011. But also, I think that things could just generally get worse for people if the decline continues and we stay with low growth patterns over an extended period of time. That would be much worse for people and much more likely to spur conflict than if we were able to sustain growth and decrease the deficit here in the United States, which is what our evidence says is happening in the status quo.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so for the 2AC, I'll answer the arguments that they made on the case page, and then answer their budget disadvantage. It's 4 minutes, right? Mm-hmm. Before I answer their case arguments, I'll first extend the Bullard evidence. The Bullard evidence says that transportation apartheid is occurring now, and that people don't have access to cars, and that poor people of color uniquely don't have access to cars. Our evidence indicates that our society is based on cars and based on the notion that you need a car in order to get to places. This is proven by how in Atlanta, for example, you need a car just to drive 20 minutes away or drive to the nearest debate tournament. The first argument they make is that transportation is not enough. Our evidence indicates that transportation is a good starting point because it gives people the freedom to get a job and have economic equality. The second argument that they make is that the roads argument is outdated. Our evidence is much more recent on this question and says that we still need cars. Remember, this is still proven by places in Atlanta and places like Houston, where I grew up, where you need a car to get around. There's not enough public transportation. The MARTA exists now, but that only goes to certain places. But on the whole, you still need a car to get around to places. The third argument he makes about space is not relevant. Yes, we can agree that space and that things are not always close together, but our argument is that if we provide public transportation, we can make things closer to each other, which would be able to solve. Now the budget disadvantage. First, as proven in cross-checks by Ross, the Iraq and Afghanistan war are costing us trillions of dollars, and Obama also passed a stimulus package, which means the impact should have already happened. We should have already seen economic collapse if it's true that spending will hurt the economy. The plan is a drop in the bucket relative to these other spending measures, which proves that we would have a limited effect and a negligible impact on our budget. Second argument is that is a link turn. we create more transportation, we create more economic opportunities for people to get jobs, so we solve the unemployment crisis because people are able to go out, find jobs, and have a better way to have transportation to those jobs. Third argument is that their evidence about credit downgrading has already happened. That Moody downgraded us a few months ago, and so that should have already triggered the impact and should have already made people very afraid of the U.S. credit rating. Also, it's not unique because spending continues to increase at record levels. This is RCP 12. Under the Obama administration, if you compare it to what has happened in the Bush years, then you have an 8% increase, which is historically high. Obama increased it year after year. Also, non-unique, the defense spending bill increases spending. This is Associated Press in 2012. The House Armed Service Committee overwhelmingly backed the $642 billion defense bill and ignores the Pentagon's cost-saving request. Despite the clamor for fiscal discipline, the committee crafted a military spending blueprint that's $8 billion more than Obama and Republicans agreed to. And the U.S. is not key to the global economy. This is Merrill Lynch in 2006. A sharp slowdown in the U.S. economy is unlikely to drag the global economy down. There are strong sources of growth outside the U.S. that should also prove resilient. Behind this decoupling is a higher non-U.S. domestic demand, a rise in intra-regional trade, and macroeconomic policies in many of the world's economies. Asia, Japan, and India all appear to be all placed. Also, there's no internal link because defense spending will not cause a U.S. collapse. This is Stiglitz, a professor at Columbia, in 2012. Underemployment jeopardizes our country's future. We should view it with suspicion the claim that exceeding a certain debt to GDP ratio will trigger a crash. The U.S. has managed to even bigger deficits, and there is no risk that we will not pay what we owe. Borrowing to invest is different than borrowing from consumption. Also, last argument is that economic decline will not cause the war. This is Ferguson, a professor of history at Harvard, in 2006. Germany started war after its economy recovered. Not all countries affected by the Depression were taken over by fascist regimes, nor did all wars start. No relationship between economics and conflict is discernible for the century as a whole. Some wars came after growth, others were causes rather than consequences of economic catastrophe, and severe economic crises were not followed by wars.
Okay. You make the argument that people who don't have access to cars are in trouble because they don't have the ability to access other parts of our society.
Correct.
I guess I'm a little unclear about why putting in sidewalks would enable someone to travel all the way across Atlanta or travel what would normally be like a 20-minute car ride. It seems like it's just infeasible because of how our city is laid out for you to walk some places.
Well, sidewalks are a good starting point because they allow people immediate access to things like shopping centers, etc., which Evans talks about.
Assuming you live really close to a shopping center, right? Like you have to live within a few miles for a sidewalk really to be a viable strategy,
without that sidewalk, there's absolutely no way that you would be able to get to those places, and it would be incredibly difficult considering the way roads are laid out, etc. Also, the plan would also include things like increased buses and other sort of increases in the equality of transportation.
Okay, so if they have to get around the city, they still have to rely on stuff like the MARTA bus.
Right.
Okay.
Well, we would make that more accessible. We would provide more of those.
How would you make that more accessible?
Currently, there's not a lot of, or our evidence indicates that there's not a whole lot of bus stations and a lot of sort of ways people can sort of access transportation in those
Wouldn't that make our transportation system more complicated and harder for people to navigate around?
Well,
harder to manage?
It would be complicated in terms of it would.
It seems like MARTA is always having stops because
of
construction and problems like that.
Well, I mean, it would be complicated in terms of there would be more of it. I don't think that it's like overly simplistic now anyway.
I'll be presenting the 2NC, and I'll only be answering arguments made on the spending disadvantage. First, I will start off with an overview. Budget overview. A, magnitude. Economic collapse, risk global nuclear war. Extended Harris and Barrow 2009. Conflict increases when the economy is not stable. Next, terrorist groups will become self-radicalized because the people in the Middle East region will start to pursue nuclear ambitions, and this leads to a global nuclear war. And B is the time frame. We're on the brink now, and the AF plan means that more money will be spent, which traditionally public transportation bills normally cost $53 billion, and that's according to our Gostin and Palmer 2009 card. On to line by line. First, answers to Iraq already cost a lot of money. First, yes, Iraq did cost a lot of money, but the stimulus in Iraq, all that kind of increase in spending happened in 2008. We're talking about the president, which is 2012. Next, talks about how they'll have to create better jobs, but one, transportation won't be able to create better jobs because by the time the transportation project started to be built, our economy would have already collapsed. Next, group the non-unique arguments. Set first, our uniqueness card post-date theirs is from 5/23/12, while theirs is only from 5/10/12, which means that our card assumes the current economic condition. It also predicts the next fiscal year. It says that Obama's spending will continue to stay balanced, and it's currently projected the next spending projected by the Congressional Budget Office. So it says it won't rise more than 0.4%. Next, talks about how the U.S. economy is not considered the global economy. Once again, this card is, I think, from 2006. It doesn't assume 2008. 2008 economic conditions where the United States economy did falter, and what happened as a result is the rest of the economy, such as China, countries in Asia and Europe, also collapsed as well because of the United States economy. So that card is outdated. And next, the no internal link argument. First, extend our internal link, continue deficit spending will collapse the economy. This is growth. 2011. It talks about currently how spending is a matter of national security, and once a nation starts to, I guess, have economic direction, it leads to other nations that are radicalizing to start building nuclear weapons. Next, group the arguments about the conflicts. I guess economic collapse don't lead to war. Once this card only cites an example of Germany, but we know during World War II, the United States was going, World War II was going through the Great Depression. As a result, the United States did become entangled in the war. Also, when economies are down, the best way for them to make money is to start building war defense industry, and that's what happened in World War II, which led to us coming out the Great Depression, which means that there is a link between economic collapse and war starting to happen. Also, extend the Harris Burroughs 2009 that says economic collapse will risk global nuclear war. The reason why this is the case is because it talks about, once again, like the Great Depression, how there were a lot of different democracies and multi-ethnic societies, and since the economies were volatile, it means that it led to conflicts being able to potentially grow. And also, it gives a specific example of that the Middle East and the youth unemployment is reduced. And it talks about how terrorist groups will become self-radicalized because they feel like the United States economy won't be strong enough to counter them. Also, it talks about how it leads to other crises and preemption.
Okay, I guess let's first talk about the argument about what the U.S. is key to the global economy. Places like India and China, their GDPs are growing at tremendous rates. I think India just surpassed the 5 trillion mark, China just surpassed the 7 trillion mark. Why would a decline of the U.S. economy implicate those growing economies that seem to be growing independently of our recession?
Okay, I would say this for sure, that if the United States economy faltered, that means that we will no longer, like a lot of the reason why other economies are growing is because of trading. So if the United States economy falters, that means they won't be able to trade as much, which means that they won't be able to increase their GDP.
So trading, those countries trade with other countries, such as the European market also has a high demand for goods, and the African market is also growing. Why wouldn't they just trade with those other economies? And the
European market and the African market, even if they combine, they still want, I guess, amass as much as United States marketing, being able to buy goods. And second, the African economy is really linked to the European economy, and as we're saying now, the United States economy is doing better, but countries such as Germany and such are not doing as well.
Let's talk about the impact, I guess. The impact you read says that economic decline will cause a nuclear war. I guess why would countries like the U.S. who would face tremendous economic turmoil, why would they face outwards and sort of project aggression outwards instead of like helping their own populations and providing bread lines, stuff like that? Why is there a need to project aggression outwards, I guess?
Well, it's not talking about projecting aggression outwards. It's talking about how once the United States economy collapses, how the Middle Eastern countries will project, I guess, war towards the United States. So it talks about once the economy collapses, how it would lead to terrorist groups in the Middle East becoming radicalizing and getting their hands on weapons. So it's more like them becoming aggressive towards the United States.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. No further questions.
I'm going to give you the 1 hour where I'm going to talk about the case debate exclusively and not talk about the disadvantage because my partner already covered that in the 2NC. All right, is everyone ready? Wonderful. Our first argument on case is that they have the wrong starting point. There are a variety of other reasons that there is social injustice in the United States that are not related to transportation. For example, our segregated housing, essentially in the United States, our bad land use policies, our unequal healthcare system, our poor educational funding, and all of our welfare policies are all situations that reinforce social injustice. Starting with transportation is ineffective. They think that they're Rosa Parks, but Rosa Parks was an activist, not someone who was asking the government to make a minor reform that wouldn't actually make people's lives that much better. Think about it. If you don't have access to a car and you need to get to a hospital, having someone tell you, at least you can walk on the sidewalk the 5 miles to the hospital, isn't actually making your life any better. The problem is that we've got too many people who can't afford to buy cars. Not that we need to cater to creating this class of carless individuals. Instead, we should try and increase the number of people who have access to cars. The next argument I'm going to extend is our Martin's evidence that says it's impossible to reach equality in transportation. There will always be some people who are closer to the important places in their lives than other people are. It will always be some sort of a difference. And our transportation policies are only serving to cover up these inequalities instead of actually stopping them. Our goal should be to get people out of poverty so that they can afford cars, instead of just telling them that they should walk or that they should somehow have to act differently than other people. We should focus on trying to get them to where they can afford cars, which is why you should vote negative to preserve economic growth with the budget disadvantage.
I'm about to give the 1AR, where I'll answer first the arguments that were made in the 1NR about the case, and then I'll answer the arguments that were made in the 2NC about overspending. Is everyone ready? The negative says a lot of things that sound good, but they fundamentally do not have an answer to the argument that transportation resources are currently inadequate for poor communities and communities of color. Being able to get to a hospital if you're sick, or to your job, wherever that may be, is absolutely critical to the most important parts of people's lives, and the current infrastructure simply cannot support that. Only the plan can increase public transportation and active transportation in a way that allows those people to live more fulfilling lives. The negative responds to this problem by saying, well, things will never be perfect. That may be true, but that doesn't mean that we can't make things better. Even if there's one person after the plan, and there's probably millions, who will be able to get to a hospital to care for their ailment, that's a reason why you should be able to vote affirmative. The 1NR is right that there's lots of other kinds of social injustice. So I don't know why it is that they're resisting such a critical policy that would make it better. Even if it is getting better in some ways, it's not enough. Roads don't work for a substantial number of people who don't have cars, and they have no solution for all of the people who currently can't get to the places where they need to go. On their spending disadvantage. Economic collapse simply will not cause war. We know this from economic declines in 2009 and 2001, plus a lot of historical data that's referenced in our Ferguson evidence. Economic decline did precede World War II, but that ignores the fact that many wars started without economic declines, and every time there's an economic decline, there simply has not been a war. The plan is not overspending. It's a critical priority and boosts employment, which our Stiglitz evidence says is the backbone of the economy. We're already spending trillions on 2 wars and bank bailouts. The negative would have you believe that we can give trillions to rich people without overspending, but a few extra billion for those who are low income is too much money, which doesn't make any sense. Even if Obama is decreasing money now, which I don't think he is, because we have evidence that we're spending hundreds of billions on the military, the fact we spent so much in the past should disprove all of their arguments.
I'll be doing the final negative 2NR speech. First, I'll be looking at the spending this at, and from then I will go on to the case arguments. First, I would like to extend our impact to our spending this at. It's that once economic decline happens, it will lead to global nuclear war, and this is our Harris and Burroughs 2009 card. Also, I would like to extend parts of it. I would like to extend the magnitude. The magnitude is global nuclear war that will result in a world in which we have global nuclear war. That means that these poor people will also die as a result. And in addition, if the economy collapses, I mean, they won't be able to get some of the vital services that they receive, such as social service, which means that the world will be worse, and the world will you pass the affirmative plan, which will allow transportation, but at the same time, like a month after you pass the bill, these people won't be able to get basic necessities, which means that in this world you must vote against the affirmative plan in order to ensure that our economy doesn't collapse. Also extend across our uniqueness card, which is Baker 12, that talks about how the United States is playing a big fiscal discipline role. Even when they come up and say that the United States is spending all this kind of money, once again, our card accounts for that because it's post-dates it. Second, all the plans they talk about spending a lot of money are already allocated in the budget. The thing that's unique about transportation is that transportation bills pass like a certain allocation for 6 years. And that means that, like, I gave an example of 2003 through 2009, how it cost $53 billion, which means that in the world of affirmative meal costs $53 billion. So don't let them fool you with the argument drop in the bucket. It's not a drop in the bucket. It's the whole entire bucket of water. So once again, you have to vote against it. Next, they're going to talk about how they create more jobs. So once again, they won't be able to create these jobs because by the time they do the spending, by the time they spend the money, the economy would have already collapsed. So once again, spending will outweigh this because in a world in which the economy collapses, that means that the world will be worse off for poor people because government won't be able to provide necessities. On to the case, the biggest argument is that we're going to extend across the argument that you can't just solve them for transportation doesn't mean that these people will have access to housing and access to social service. It means that the affirmative plan don't necessarily solve. Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm going to give a 2AR where I will answer the arguments made on case and then also rebut their budget disadvantage and then explain why we think the app is a better idea than the status quo and the budget disadvantage. Okay. First on the case flow, our racial apartheid impact outweighs their economic collapse impact for a few reasons. First, it's a real-world impact that is systemically felt by millions of people of color and low-income people every single day. Millions of our own citizens don't have equal access to transportation, which means that these people don't have a way to get to their job or access to healthcare, or really do anything that is really close, or do anything that is not really close to them within about a mile or two away. If you live in Atlanta, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Anywhere you need to go, you need a car. To get to downtown, you need a car. To get to Midtown, you need a car. Probably to get to school, you take the bus, which is a few miles away. People simply do not have access cannot use the roads if they do not have the means to afford a car. The second reason why our affirmative outweighs is that economic collapse is empirically disproven. It's never happened before, which means that we outweigh on probability and time frame. Even if it's true that in a world of economic collapse, there will be lots of people dying if in a nuclear war, that does not matter because it's never happened before. It is simply a hypothetical scenario which has never been realized before. So the only argument they have extended on the case flow is that we do not solve because transportation is not enough. Again, I will extend the argument that transportation is a good starting point because it gives people a way to get to their jobs, get to healthcare, and access other things that they need in their everyday lives. Now the budget disadvantage. There's a few arguments here that I'll extend. The first argument is that our Ferguson evidence, who is a professor at Harvard and more qualified than their evidence, says that there is no relationship between economic collapse and war, and that wars do not always follow economic collapses, and when they do, there are a confluence of other factors that influence that. The second argument I will extend is that we are already spending so much now. We have spent on the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the bailout, the healthcare plan. The plan is simply just a drop in the bucket. It's only millions of dollars compared to the trillions of dollars in the deficit now. Our Stiglitz evidence also says that we have run much bigger deficits, which is a reason you should vote affirmative.